Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Anything with Alvin, where today we're going to be taking on recreating the famous pastrami sandwich from Katz's Deli here in New York. Now both the sandwiches and the restaurant itself are pretty iconic in New York, and a lot of tourists usually come from all over the world just to try it, which means it's quite popular with many long lines. Now I'm not usually someone who likes to wait that long, so I decided to see if we can make a version of this at home and maybe stop in on a day that's not so busy to see how our version stacks up. Let's get started. This episode is sponsored by Bombas, aka the most comfortable socks I've ever tried. And while they're comfy, the best part is that for every item purchased, one is donated. They've donated over 100 million articles of clothing so far across all 50 states. So you're not just getting your new favorite pair of socks, you're helping Bombas donate some to someone else too. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/babish and use code babish20 at checkout. Now for today's episode, we're going to be making two sandwiches. One is the corned beef Reuben, and the other is their classic pastrami on rye with some mustard. I believe these are the two meats that they're most famous for, and so what that means is we're going to need to start with some brisket. And the first step is to trim the brisket to remove any excess fat, just to make sure that there's not too much fat. We still want to keep a good amount of fat on the meat because that's going to have some flavor and help protect the meat against the heat later. So not only am I going to trim this brisket, I'm going to separate this brisket into two parts. The brisket is made of two muscles, the point and the flat, as they are colloquially called. One is a lot fattier and rides on top, and the other is on the bottom and is a lot more lean. If you've ever had fatty versus lean brisket, the fatty part is the part that consists of the point. We're going to be using the flat part for the corned beef, and we're going to be using the fattier point part for the pastrami. Once those are nice and trimmed up, although I'm sure many master butchers out there could do a lot better, we're going to go ahead and make our brine for the meats. In a pot, I'm combining 8 cups of boiling water, 3.5 cups of kosher salt, 1 cup of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of allspice berries, 4 star anise pods, 2 tablespoons of yellow mustard seeds, 4 teaspoons of cloves, 1 stick cinnamon, 8 teaspoons of sodium nitrate would help give it that pink cured look, and 6 bay leaves, mixing that together until everything is combined. Then I'm going to add in 8 cups of ice just to cool this liquid down before I go in with both the point and the flat part of the brisket. Then we're going to top this off with a little bit more water and make sure to submerge this and let this brine for quite some time, at least 7 days and up to 10. And now I'm starting to understand the labor that goes into making something like corned beef or pastrami. And because this takes quite a long time, Rachel went ahead and made a swap of this at home with the exact same recipe. So now this is what it looks like after it's been brining for 9 days. Now the meat has been brined, we're going to pull the meat out, discard the brine, rinse the meat and try to get off any of those cloves that might be stuck to it, then replace the water. And we're going to leave the flat inside the water when we add some aromatics to boil our corned beef in. This is going to be half an onion, 2 celery ribs, 6 garlic cloves, and 2 bay leaves, just to infuse a little bit more aromatics in there. Once this is brought to a boil, we're going to reduce this to a simmer and simmer this for about 3 hours or so until it's nice and tender. We're going to set the point, the fatty part, off to the side for the pastrami. What's really exciting about pastrami is that it does get a nice little spice rub on the outside before going outside to hit the smoker. So in a mortar and pestle, I'm going to go ahead and make just that. First grinding up 4 tablespoons of whole black peppercorns and 2 tablespoons of whole coriander seeds, smashing and mortar and pestling until these are nice and broken up. There's still going to be some slight chunks, but most of it should be broken down. Then I'm going to add in the rest of the ingredients. 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of garlic powder, 1 tablespoon of onion powder, 2 tablespoons of yellow mustard seeds, and 1 teaspoon of mustard powder. Giving that a mix, and our spice rub is ready. So now that the point of our brisket has been brined, I'm going to go ahead and pat this dry on all sides just to make sure that the rub kind of sticks in a little bit better and doesn't kind of wash off in the process. We're going to apply our spice rub pretty vigorously all over each side of the pastrami to make sure that it's evenly coated, and then we're going to go ahead and take this outside to our electric smoker. Andrew does have a smoker that we're fortunate enough to use to give it a more classic flavor than doing it in an oven. I'm smoking this at about 225 degrees over some wood pellets for a couple hours until the internal temperature hits about 160 or so. That's when people refer to that period as kind of the stall, where it takes quite some time to get the temperature all the way up to around 200, which is our goal temperature. Once it hits 160, I'm going to wrap this in foil to help create some steam and help really make that temperature go up a lot quicker. Now it takes about 7.5 hours for us to make this pastrami hit about 200, at which point it's smelling really good. We're going to go ahead and take this off and into our studio and let this rest while we go make a visit to Katz's Deli itself. A little field trip to Katz's Deli here in the city, which is a pretty cool institution. It's been around for such a long time, and I've personally gone past it many times, but I've actually never gone in. Maybe it's because of tourists, maybe it was because of the lines and the prices, but I never really felt the urge to try it out. But going in, I can see why this place is pretty cool. It has a very interesting feel to it, like it's almost like you step back in time. A lot of people, a lot of old vintage signs, and just lots of really skilled cutters cutting away at pastrami, corned beef, and just making sandwiches for hundreds of hungry diners. What's cool is that when you go and order your sandwich from the cutters, they're cutting it directly for you, and they give you some samples of the meat while you're waiting in line for them to make your sandwich. It's a really fun time just watching them make your sandwich right in front of you, and just seeing their skills, the way that they handle their knives and the fork to cut the meat so quickly, so thinly, but also stack it so perfectly high on a sandwich that's bursting with meat. It was just really fun experience. So now that we've brought these back to the studio, we have to make sure that we know the standard that we are up against. This is the real deal. We ordered 4 sandwiches: a corned beef Reuben, a pastrami Reuben, a corned beef on rye, and a pastrami on rye, just to see the multiple combinations that they can come up with. Let's go ahead and give the corned beef Reuben a try. This one has a lot of flavor, mostly because there's some extra dressing, cheese, and sauerkraut that goes well with the corned beef, which really helped the sandwich, as I think the corned beef itself was a little bit dry on that day. Eating their pastrami and rye was my favorite kind of sandwich. You can taste the meat more, you can taste the smoke, the flavor, and with the pastrami and the mustard together, I really like that combination. And so I'm going to be able to keep these flavor profiles in mind when testing out our version of their sandwiches. Okay, so here is our corned beef next to our pastrami. There's a really interesting visual difference between the two, which makes sense because one's been boiled and one had a spice rub and was smoked for 8 hours. So first we're going to go ahead and assemble our corned beef sandwich. I'm going to take our corned beef and attempt to slice it similarly to how they did it in the shop. Obviously I'm nowhere nearly as good, so my slices definitely are on the thicker side. So to make our Reuben, we made a quick Russian dressing on the side with a few ingredients. That's going to go on one side of the bread. And then we're going to use some interesting techniques that we did see them do at Katz's. When they make their Reuben, which involves cheese and sauerkraut, what they do is they place a pile of sauerkraut on a plate, top that with a good amount of slices of Swiss cheese, and then just microwave that until the cheese has been melted and kind of coat the sauerkraut. And then when you invert it using a piece of bread, it doesn't stick to the plate because the sauerkraut is touching the plate, not the cheese. And it's a pretty easy way to get the cheese and sauerkraut on one side of the bread without having to stick the whole sandwich in some oven, which I guess would be really slow for a restaurant like Katz's. So I'm a huge fan of this technique. It's really satisfying to do, and you can just slap that on the rest of your sandwich. That is our version of the corned beef Reuben from Katz's Deli. Now let's make the pastrami sandwich. I'm going to take our pastrami, cut off some of those thinner end bits. Look at the spice rub and the marbling on that. I'm a really big fan of this bark and how good this looks. It's almost like pastrami burnt ends, which will make a really nice snack for everybody off camera. I'm gonna go ahead and give this a slice as well. Still not really good with the slicing yet, so these are thicker slices of pastrami than maybe people are used to, but we're gonna cut it the same and use a really interesting cutting technique where they trim the edges of the slices and then stack them on top of each other so that it ends up being the perfect width of the bread, giving it a nice, beautiful, fanned out curved shape that makes the sandwich look really cool. One side of the bread is gonna get mustard. I'm gonna slap that on top. And this is our version of the pastrami on rye sandwich from Katz's Deli. Cut these in half, examine the cross section, and make sure that these are in fact loaded with a lot of meat. So comparing these with some sandwiches that we brought back from Katz's, I'd like to say that they're actually very visually similar. Our meat ratios are pretty spot on, and our meat color might be slightly pinker, but that's because we pulled it fresh. And I'm pretty happy with how almost indistinguishable they are. Now it's time for the real test. What does it taste like? So our corned beef Reuben tasted a little bit different. I think our corned beef was a little bit stronger with the freshness of the aromatics and the spices, and I liked it because it was a lot juicier than the one we had at Katz's. And inside a corned beef Reuben style sandwich, I think it was really good. As far as the pastrami, I actually liked ours a little bit better too, because I personally prefer more of like a chewier steak-like texture versus a kind of meat that just kind of crumbles and falls apart. But hey, to each their own. A lot of people in the studio also had differing opinions, but the most important part was that we had fun while making all of these sandwiches. And to be quite honest, it was a lot of labor. Rachel did a lot of the work by doing it ahead of time, but to make this sandwich does require a lot of time, 10 days and some smoking and hours of boiling if you're doing the other method. So hats off to anybody that has a business that sells or makes these kinds of sandwiches, because it's not as easy as people might think. And all the best part is we had about 12 people in the studio that day, which was perfect because with all of this meat and bread and sandwich flying around, everybody got to take some home and got to take a little bit of almost everything. This episode is sponsored by Bombas, aka the most comfortable socks I've ever tried. And while they're comfy, the best part is that for every item purchased, one is donated. They've donated over 100 million articles of clothing so far across all 50 states. So you're not just getting your new favorite pair of socks, you're helping Bombas donate some to someone else too. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/Babish and use code Babish20 at checkout.